Hi Robert, how you doing?
Very well, very well. Glad to be back.
Yeah, our first guest to appear twice on the Policy Scoop, so quite the honor.
Yeah, welcome, Robert. So happy
Thanks.
to see you. So happy to have you discuss such a, you know, topical issue that you've worked on very heavily in the last years. Um, shall we get started? Right? This
Yeah, I
is
mean
what we do
it's
here. We get into the good stuff right away. Like there is no long introduction.
Yeah. You do not need to introduce me again. But yeah, I don't know if you want to say anything first about like what the whole new SBTi standard says and all that. But people probably read
yeah,
Yeah.
we
some
can
things
assume that.
already. Yeah. So there was a lot of hope put into this, I think, from the CDR ecosystem, including from myself, seeing that most companies probably have to be told to buy and have been waiting on the sidelines. And I heard this in a lot of conversations with corporates that they've been waiting to see what the SBTi is going to say and been waiting for requirements. And I think especially like CFOs and so on, to open the wallet, there needs to be like someone else telling them you have to, or like it's really expected to. And it's been a big hope that this announcement, it's just a draft standard, but that it could be completely monumental for the CDR industry. And if there was a proper requirement to start scaling up CDR, that could be at least an order of magnitude more demand or more. But that's not what we see here.
Yeah, and I saw that just to put it into numbers, before the draft dropped, I saw numbers being floated of it could generate 50 to 80 megatons per year from 2030 of extra demand, right? And then I saw the numbers that Lucas May put out from Isometric that you've also looked over, who says like at present it's more like 2 megatons in 2030, which is not, it's something, but it's falls way short of what many in the industry I guess were expecting or hoping for.
Yeah, and it's mainly about them just talking about scope one requirements. So
Exactly. Yeah.
one thing is that most companies don't have very high scope one emissions to start with like over 90% emissions in scope three. But scope one is also the emission that is expected to go down to zero. So it's not a requirement to cover today's scope one emissions. It's a requirement to start buying CDR to cover your 2050 or your net zero target scope one needs. So for a lot of companies, that need is zero because they're not in a hard to abate industry and they're not going to need any removals for that. But at the same time, you have to net out all your emissions. So like you're going to have probably still quite a lot of scope three emissions because all companies are not going to drop their scope one emissions to zero. So companies outside of the SBTi and the long tail across the world is still going to have some emissions and it's going to be reflected in companies' supply chains in their scope three. So they still need it, but now there's no clear requirement to start scaling up that part.
Yeah, I don't know where you want to take it, Sebastian, but I actually was curious about the whole process because we have now in front of us the draft standard. There's going to be ample of time for people to comment on it. What happens then? Because are there like how does the SBTi work in terms of taking on board the input that they will get?
Good point.
Like how much impact can removals community have? I know like ideally this question should have come at the end of the session, but I cannot help
That's
myself.
a good
Like I
one.
want to understand.
Right. So I've been part of a external group, which is a technical advisory group that they called it, and this iteration of it was 2 years and it's ending now at the end of March, and there will be new expert groups, one on removal, one on beyond value chain mitigation, etc. So that's one group that the SBTi kind of takes input from and not as a decision-making body or anything, but just advice. And then there's a public consultation and they read everything in the public consultation and kind of summarize what that says and bring in. But then there's technical advisory council, maybe that's not the right name, but yeah, that makes decisions on standards and so on. And then you have the board as well. But that kind of council is the decision-making body. So the Secretariat, of course, has a lot of power on drafting and writing things. But they do have a lot of processes for taking in input and listening to various stakeholders and so on. So, but the various stakeholders say very different things. So the removal community is just one. You have also the traditional carbon credit community that has been lobbying the SBTi a lot. And then you have a lot of nature restoration and kind of people who do forestation. And then companies that maybe don't want to have extra requirements at all. Like they don't want to be required to stop buying anything. Or it hasn't been very costly to set a net zero target so far. Suddenly it may become that. And for some companies, especially those with high scope 1 emissions now, this may be also not popular. We'll see. It may be controversial to even have that for some subsets. So it's really trying to, I mean, you have to commend them and give them kudos for the great work that the Secretariat is doing, because they're being bombarded like all parts of society, different interest groups that have different perspectives. But I do think they take everything into consideration, like and actually read all the input and so on.
But I mean, that's the question. That's also like obvious thinking that I had. They will get requests from all sides with all the different viewpoints. So whose voice in the end is going to be the one that matters? Is it the input from the public consultation? Is the technical advisory group? Like, how does that dynamics work? How has it worked before? I mean, of course, I have to say also, I mean, in general, I think this is a great step, the draft standard as we see it today. It clearly means that, whilst some time ago, I think, at least in among some stakeholders, the relevance of SBTi seemed to be kind of starting to slide away, I think it's now firmly back on the table. Like SBTi is taking removals seriously. That's a fact, given what they have put forward. But now with all these different options in front of us and all the different stakeholders that will, by default, advocate for very different options, where can we land and how to move the needle to one side or another?
Well, somewhat opaque, any kind of organization like this, exactly how that happens. But I would think, from the way I interpret it, that the formal advisory groups that are set up like are in one bucket, and then the public consultation is another bucket, and these are taken in, and exactly how they're weighted against each other, I think it's hard to say. Maybe that's not formalized, but I think the ones that someone that would carry more weight than removal companies are scientists and the companies themselves that have SBTi targets. I don't think that it's so important what removal companies say, because whatever we say who kind of working in the industry would seen as self-serving to some extent. And so the scientific side and the corporates that would have to follow the standard would be more important.
And on that note, can we talk about kind of scope 1 versus 2 and 3, right? Because I think that they clearly have a good rationale why they only included scope 1, right? Like it makes sense. You pointed it out in your blog, Robert, that if all companies were in SBTi and we did only scope 1, yeah, okay, fair, that would work, but that's not the reality. And so and also the double counting issue, obviously, and can we even project scope 3 emissions at net zero, all of that stuff. But how do we move forward? Because they have a good rationale that they can stand behind for saying we're going to stop at scope 1 for this. So do you think there is even a way to go beyond that? Or is that a deadlock?
I don't think that's a good rationale. You have to estimate your scope 1 emissions too. That's also an estimation. Maybe it's easier to do so than for scope 3. But since your target is for all scopes and you need CDR for all scopes, you're not going to be able to reach your target if you haven't started to help scaling up CDR. So to me, that rationale doesn't hold. And the double counting part is solved by, you're having good accounting. And it's not something that needs to be solved today, but the greenhouse gas protocol will be updated. If you only need to buy 1 ton of removal for the same emission. So the emitter, the scope 1 emitter, and the company that uses the service would be able to use the same removal. And the SBTi alludes to this, saying that you would need to either make sure that your value chain your supply chain partners have bought removals for remaining emissions, or that you help them pay for that. So they already say that. So the double counting shouldn't be an issue. If you make everything is about making a good estimation for how much CDR you're probably going to need. And you're going to need some for sure for scope 3. It's not going to be zero.
But then that's kind of the point. And do you think there's a way forward, even in this draft, that we will see more than scope 1? Because it's currently not on the tables, right? So do you think that
it's not
can change or not?
It's not a question that's open for consultation. So that's,
exactly.
Of course, that's not a good sign. But you never know, that things can change depending on what kind of input people are giving. At least I think we definitely should push for a clear recommendation to start scaling up CDR for your scope 3 needs as well. And to have that recommendation next to the requirement in the language. Otherwise, I think there's a big risk that CFOs are going to say no to some companies that otherwise, if there was no standard at all, would have bought. So I think there's some risk of creating more harm than good as well.
So one question that I got already before we had this session was obviously removals come up in the context of these hard to abate or residual emissions. And what are the kind of reasoning how companies can actually justify those hard to abate emissions? How does that work in practice?
Justify why you have remaining emissions?
Yeah, and why you have them at this level and not on a different level.
Right. So in the documentation that came with this draft standard, there's the target setting documentation as a appendix document, and also cross-sectoral pathway where they have gone through a number of different scenarios that's used in climate modeling and looking at how much residual emissions different sectors likely to use. And that can serve as a way of benchmarking against. But that's very conservative. They estimate a need for 1.3 gigaton removal, I think. So it's very low. And that would be for the entire world, not just for SBTi companies. And I mean, I do think that you have to have a bit more broader view than that, looking at where is CDR cost efficient, given the necessary guardrails that it's safe and not harmful for people and environment, and it's also permanent. Then I think the market should allocate CDR. Whatever it's most cost efficient, we should use it. So if aviation and maritime transport, it looks like maybe half of the emissions there, CDR will be the best choice. And then there's a temporary need for CDR. If you want to reach net zero 2040 and the rest of the world is reaching net zero by 2070, then you're going to need CDR for your scope 3 as well. So I think the justification comes from it's the cheapest option, and to some sense it's the only option maybe for some of your scope 3 because your suppliers are still emitting.
Yeah, Sebastian, how do you want to do it? Do you want to take some questions we're getting in the chat, or you have some yourself?
I mean, maybe it's worth digging a little bit into it because the title of our is as well, right? Step forward, a missed opportunity. And yeah. I think the point that you made, Robert, about could this potentially even backfire? I think that's something that we should maybe dig a little bit deeper into it, right? First, we were hoping for this huge step forward. And I think we can all agree that we've made a step in the right direction by at least having CDR recognized and being on the table, right? But this potential backlash of doing more harm than good, as you say, that's huge, right?
Yeah. What do you think about that?
That could really harm the industry. I mean, based on also my work, at Carbon Future, folks are trying to convince buyers every day to get into the sector, right? And I estimate 100 to 200 people in our industry that spend their whole day doing nothing else but talking to corporates and convincing them to buy CDR. Mm-hmm. And that's a lot of people for very few companies that actually start buying. And considering that, what I hear over and over again is that people, for now, it was the uncertainty around SBTi, right? And it was the waiting, kind of, let's see what SBTi says. But I definitely see a risk that people start hiding behind it now and basically saying, just scope 1, we're fine, right? Or just 10% max, we don't want to go beyond that. And no matter the industry. And so this is what I wanted to talk a little bit about is how can we minimize that risk? Like what can we do in this consultation to minimize the risk of it actually backfiring?
Yeah, to me, this push for a recommendation and like, okay, so we only require scope 1 because like we can't require too much and so on. Like that's going to be the mandatory part, but we give a strong recommendation to start buying CDR for the rest. And like a responsible company would also scale up for your scope 3 needs. Like I think that's a compromise that could possibly be made, like where at least there's a clear recommendation, and if you want to be really responsible company, you do both. But we're not gonna like hold your feet to the fire. That's just gonna be for scope 1 that will hold your feet to the fire. I think that could work, and that would minimize the risk, I think.
Okay.
What do you think about that, Eva?
I think it's a kind of it's a reasonable approach. One question I saw popping up here in this chat is, so what does it mean between now and the end of the consultation in June? Like, what does it mean for the CDR sector in these coming months? Like, how is it a positive movement? I mean, I would say cautiously positive, right? It's a maybe smaller step than some hoped for, but it looks to be kind of a pragmatic approach. Of course, the fact that there are these options on the table and we don't know where we land, there is also quite a bit of uncertainty there. So what kind of impact does this consultation in the forum it landed 2 days ago, like what kind of impact does it actually have over the coming months? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's really hard to say. You can see some are kind of focusing on the positive part, like Climeworks as well had an update on their website, focusing on now CDR is recognized and that you need to start doing things on that. And yeah, I think it can go both ways as well, right?
It's the question of interpretation, right? You can pick up the positive elements and build on those, or you can pick up of things that you were hoping to see but can't see today, and hence kind of make the case for the opposite direction.
Yeah, I can't help being, but I'm always going to be the Cassandra, like not the optimist. I'm going to point out to the dangers and so on. Like sometimes that people maybe don't like that because they don't. It's going to be a bad vibe or mood, and sure, but I still think we have to. Someone have to do that as well.
And I mean, for me, it's right now, it's still a draft, right? So we don't have more certainty than we had before, because this can still go in many directions. Like, I think if we talk in 2026, when this is finalized, then we can talk about the exact impact on the CDI industry. For now, what we see is a positive sign that, as you said, Robert, people can kind of cling on to, right? But at the same time, I think more than anything for the CDI industry, for me, this is a bit of a wake-up call that we need to, get to work and try to make our voices heard beyond our small bubble. Because as Robert said, we will all speak up, we will all submit our input, right? And hopefully some of us will also be represented in the new expert groups and so on. But it is self-serving when it comes from the CDI industry. So the question is, how do we get others, especially corporates, to make this argument? And this is, I think, where, if you have good ideas, that's worth sharing, because I think that would be the most impactful way forward.
Yeah, so getting credible voices behind the need for CDR narrative, right? That's basically what the community is going to be looking for, hopefully in the next few months.
Academics and corporates, I guess, I also want to mention academics, because Robert was absolutely right there.
Yeah, for sure. Although academics, how does the science-based targets, right? It's in the name, science. But I also have heard this being made fun of in some circles. So how do the academics feed into this actually? Like how does new science feed into SBTi? Are they, for example, academics, would they also be the ones who would respond to the public consultation, or is there another setting where they can have a say?
There's a scientific advisory board as well, with kind of academics on it. So that's one
So
way.
it's most of those people that's already are present in the SBTi circle, in their advisory boards, and then okay.
Yeah, and then the people in the technical council.
Mm-hmm.
That's people who, I mean, I don't suggest everyone should go lobby them, but like, you know, that's important people who make decisions as well. But yes, academics can respond to the consultation, of course. Yeah, I think it also ties really down to how we see CDR as we discussed a little bit. Is it something that's just a necessary evil for the very, very small last mile, and should be avoided? Or is it a tool to make net zero cheaper and faster, giving necessary guardrails? You know,
Yeah.
I stated where I stand in that part, but and just to be clear, I'm not advocating for, you know, like a massive need of CDR. I still think it's just going to be like in this low single gigatons. It doesn't make sense for electricity or like a lot of emissions. But the temporary use for your scope 3 is going to be significant, and then the long-term use, it makes sense for some categories like aviation, etc. But it's not like it's not a payment for sins. It's a tool.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And one thing that I think we should need to touch on, I also saw it coming up in the comments, is the durability discussion. We've only kind of quickly passed it, right? But it is important. And as you said, obviously, SBTi is managing so many different stakeholder groups, right? And there are stakeholder groups who will be lobbying in a very different direction to what people in this group might be saying, right? But right now, it hasn't come out with a clear definition, right? It's basically had this kind of gradual transition model, which seems a very complex way to talk about durability. But where do you guys think will we land? Is there a way to embed like for like, or is that too controversial for this context?
No, it's not at all. It's one of the options. There's two options.
Yeah.
One is like for like. And if you look at the accessory material and the target setting, it's great. And now they're separating CO2 and other greenhouse gases, which we talked about last time. That net zero greenhouse gas targets are stupid. Like you should have separate targets for separate gases. And that's exactly what's suggested. So like I was super happy when I saw that. And that's a great way of setting targets. And you estimate your need for CO2, and you only use permanent carbon removal for your remaining fossil CO2 emissions, and scale that upward. But it's option 2, you mix it all. So if you look at the graphs for examples for airlines, in option 1, they use an airline as the example. In option 1, you would have only permanent carbon removal for your remaining fossil jet fuels. But in option 2 is like 60% forest at 2050 for your remaining jet fuel. Like, so that would be a loophole to use forests temporary, like at a high risk of reversal, to enable continued fossil fuel use. I don't think the SBTi wants that. And I think that as it's currently written, that would be kind of a loophole.
But you think that's on basically like for like is on the table, as we know, and
Yes.
you think it has a good chance of making it through into the final standard?
It's
Depending
science-based
on
after all.
the input.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder how much impact will the developments on voluntary carbon markets have on this? I mean, also on the whole, not only like for like, because I know that, for example, ICVCM is really looking to try to make different durability removals more comparable through, you know, different tools, you know, building on whatever buffer pools, insurances, and so on, other things. There's clearly a direction of travel there. Under Article 6, we see also this wish of, you know, there's just one type of removals, kind of, you know, one set of rules. How do you see that impacting this whole like-for-like conversation and the SBTi work?
It is important to hold the line, but I think it really comes down to also misunderstanding about why you're even doing this. Like, if you're using the BBCM approach and taking responsibility for ongoing emissions, Like, there's no reason to just buy permanent carbon removal. Like, you should focus on whatever makes most bang for the buck. Support, avoid deforestation, like various types of carbon credits, making grants as well to companies, and that's a great part in this new draft, that they are starting to offer recognition to companies who do BVCM and who take responsibility for ongoing emissions. But when you're using CDR as a tool to continue use fossil fuels, really, like, that's what you're doing. Because there's no fossil fuels that's impossible to reduce to zero. There's always options. You just choose CDR because it's like more actionable, faster, and cheaper. Like, you can use electrofuels, but now it takes much more energy and more cost, more money. So if you're going to enable that, if you're going to enable continued fossil fuel use, it has to be permanent carbon removal. I think people get that, but since they're so stuck in this compensation mindset of like just taking responsibility, blah blah, then they see the need to use this mix. But if you see it as a tool for the kind of last emissions that you continue to use, then it's really permanent for that small part. But then it's really BVCM for the rest.
And I would say for that, like, first, for people who are listening or watching, we've done a whole show with Robert on like for like. Go listen to it. We spoke half an hour just about like for like. And hopefully there's also enough scientific evidence to make that case in this consultation, right? One topic that we haven't fully addressed head on is the three options that they offer, right? And I would quickly like us to just say, like, do we agree with those? Is there even an option for a fourth option? And as a reminder, it's kind of interim CDR, like kind of CDR milestones, voluntary action with recognition, or kind of a flexible approach, right? And Robert, I think from your piece as well, like, do you think there's even an option of a fourth option, or is it basically just the first option as the best that we can get out of this year?
Well, you never know. So you should probably be proposing a fourth option in the consultation.
That's what I thought you'd say. What would that look like?
Well, you would estimate your total need of CDR at net zero, and then start to scale up towards that. That's it. And your total need is, of course, for all scopes, because your net zero target is not just for scope 1.
Yeah.
It's very simple. And we published a CDR white paper from Milky Way on CDR target setting a couple of weeks before as well.
So if everyone starts making this case, or a lot of people, do you think we have a shot? Because there's enough time to rally the troops.
Well, hopefully, it's not really it's not how many people makes the argument, I think, but if the right type of people make the argument, maybe, the right types of groups.
It's about who will make the arguments, the credibility of the voices.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but that's a good way forward, right? Like, if we're not happy with these three options, we should talk about a fourth option. And then I think it's good if we talk about a fourth option. What you says, I think, resonates, at least with me. I think it probably resonates with a lot of people. It just makes sense, right? It's logical. So hopefully it can be spread and taken up by folks.
Yeah. And of course, you shouldn't estimate that you're going to need like 90% removals for something. Like, it should be realistic, and you still have your reduction targets. So for most companies, maybe it's just going to be 10% or something.
Interesting.
So we're getting close on time. I'm wondering if there's any last bit we want to tackle before that.
There's a lot of exciting things in the standard, of course, that's not CDR related. I think so much hard work that's gone into this, and interesting things on environmental attribute certificates. For example, now it would be possible to use EACs to buy sustainable aviation fuel and count it against your emissions. So that's a good development, I think. But I think, something that's a bit unclear to me, maybe I haven't read carefully enough, is if you do this requirement step, if you can start to, how much weight that will, how much you can show that in your reporting and so on. It looks like take credit for it, but yeah.
Okay. A lot there. And I think it's good to end on an appreciative note as well, because obviously we've gone through all the kind of little nooks that we saw that we can open up, but there's been a lot of good work done there, and we're very appreciative that we even have this standard to discuss now, right? So this was a lot of fun.
Yeah, they're doing a great job. Like, it's a lot of hard work going in.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining, Robert, as always.
Thank
for
you, Robert.
everyone, stay tuned. Also, listen to our podcast, right? All of this will be also published in a podcast format. And until next time, thanks.
Thanks,
All right.
everyone.
Thank you for bringing me on.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.